Hi, I'm David Wilborn. This is my SISU 206 final narrative presentation, and I'll be looking at economic sanctions as a coercive tool. My original puzzle regarded China's economic sanctions on the Philippines during a territory dispute in 2012. From there, I dove further into the sanctions literature and found some pretty unexpected results. This led me to my current research question of what explains the success or failure of general economic sanctions in coercing a policy change. I would note that these are general economic sanctions targeting sectors of an economy as opposed to targeted sanctions, which look at individuals. And I would note that the threshold for success here is in coercing a policy change. Sanctions have lots of different uses as political communication or as symbolism. And so the threshold that I'll be looking at is the coercing of a policy change, only one aspect of sanction success. So let's look at the literature. For a long time, sanctions were thought to be nonsensical instruments of policy, following a few case studies of high-profile failures. However, the development of game theory and the recognition of the importance of norms has begun to change some of these perceptions over the last few decades. As of right now, there are four schools that explain sanction success or failure. The first is the domestic conditionalists, who think that sanctions hurt key constituencies in target countries, applying domestic political pressure to the target regime. Economic realists then look at total economic damage and expectations of damage, treating that as a loss of power projection. Demand conditionalists emphasize how demands of different size or over different issues can impact sanctions' likelihood of success. And complementarians think that sanctions apply indirect pressure through non-economic means, like symbolism. I chose a small n case study methodology for this, or specifically a deductive typological theory of policy success for general economic sanctions. I'll get into my variables in a minute, but the cases that I selected were the US and Haiti, the US and Cuba, China and France, and China and the Philippines. And this typology hypothesizes different outcomes based on the combinations of the variables that I outline here. For operationalizing these variables, my dependent variable was success, and I looked at the stated goals of the sanctions or how and why the sanctions ended. Status, then, is a variable that looks at a regime's ability to resist external pressures or to resist converting economic pressure into domestic political pressure. Issue salience, then, looks at whether or not the issue is more important to the sender country or the target country. Imposed costs are exactly what they sound like. And a diplomatic relationship looks at some cultural aspects like socio-demographic traits, as well as other things like alliance structures and common IGO membership. My justification for this case selection first in part rests on the assumption that these are indeed cases, that they're examples of a broader phenomenon, which is economic sanctions episodes, and that they are time and space delimited, which they are because they're dyadic in nature and they have a definitive start and end point. I use a diverse case logic of selection here because the sanctions literature has yet to substantially link these variables together. It's done a great job of identifying different important variables through a lot of different studies, but it hasn't really identified the relationships between them. And so this diverse case logic of selection does exactly that by maximizing the variance along the relevant dimensions to represent the full variation of the population. So this way, it doesn't mirror the distribution of that variation in the way that a large N study would, but it does represent all of the possible cases that one could look at, which allows me to look at a lot of different kinds of causal mechanisms through the process tracing I aim to carry out. I chose a diverse case as opposed to a typical case for this plausibility probe, because with the number of variables in play in sanctions episodes, there's really no such thing as a typical case. And then I didn't include any extreme cases, such as most or least likely cases, because those are only really advisable when a population is well understood. And as I just said, the sanctions literature hasn't done a good job of linking these variables together yet. And so this plausibility probe will hopefully be able to do that. These are my hypothesized causal mechanisms. There are a few that I'd like to point out immediately, and that is that the routes to policy success are through domestic political costs or international political costs. And those are taken directly from the domestic conditionalist literature and the economic realist literature. The other schools of thought mainly come into play in the variables, both exogenous and endogenous. These are my hypotheses. They say basically what the same slide previously did, but you can pause the video here if you'd like to look at them. The methodological criteria by which I'll be evaluating these are validity, reliability, and falsifiability, just like with any neo-positivist work. So validity is comprised of accuracy and generalizability. Accuracy is somewhat built into the typological method through the structured comparison that it forces, but the diverse case logic of selection that I did further ensures this accuracy. Then the case study format somewhat limits generalizability, but have aimed to improve case comparability, as I said earlier, by limiting the population to general sanctions only instead of targeted sanctions, and restricting the definition of success to policy capitulation. Reliability is then ensured through the documentation of sources and materials, so like publishing my guiding questions for operationalizing my variables, for example, as well as through transparency in methodological choices, like this presentation, for example. Falsifiability is then ensured through the specificity and testability of my hypotheses. The methodological trade-offs that I'm looking at partially come from the relationships between small n and then large n or interpretivist, but also there are some trade-offs even within the small n world. So that's the first one that I'm going to talk about, which is in terms of constructing the typological property space, which is the number of variables and the kinds of variables that you're using. Bennett references Sartori's ladder of abstraction when he talks about this, and the trade-off between case comparability versus generalizability, where more specific variables will allow increased case comparability, whereas broader variables will allow increased generalizability. And so I've already made some trade-offs by choosing 4 variables in my typology, partially for theoretical reasons, but in addition because I'd like the typology to be manageable enough to generalize, but also specific enough to compare cases. The benefits of using a case study approach more broadly are that you're able to uncover the causal mechanisms, which I mentioned the literature has largely neglected in favor of effects. Also, the case study approach can serve as a bridge between structure and agent-centered explanation. And so structure-centered explanation being things like the ways that costs are transferred in the international arena, whereas agent-centered explanations in this case being something like the cost that a country chooses to impose. And so these can't be mutually constitutive like they can with interpretists, but by allowing a temporal separation of these, you can allow dual attribution. In this way, case studies can serve as a bridge between a large N world and an interpretivist world through these kinds of explanations. Then again, with a typology specifically, a typology aids me in avoiding univariate thinking by really focusing on the combinations of these variables and why they lead to specific outcomes. However, there are some drawbacks of a case study approach. Again, the format and the case selection strategy limits generalizability in that I can't ascertain the frequency of causal mechanisms appearance due to my case selection strategy, although I have aimed to ameliorate this in ways that I've said earlier. Case study methodologies also lean towards type 1 errors, so throughout the process I'll need to be very careful about avoiding false positives. And then also, neopositivist logic is not as well equipped to deal with to approach how states construct others' identities as threats. And so in some ways, my presentation is vulnerable to a critique of so what, since sanctions are only tools and they're not ends themselves. Looking forward, there are a few things that I'll need to work on. One is reducing and expanding the typological property space. There are so many variables at play that I inevitably have to make choices, but I'll need to continue reflecting on these throughout the process. And lastly, I'm going to continue to refine my case selection. The TIES dataset has over 1,400 sanctions episodes, and I've only chosen 4. So it's inevitable that as I familiarize myself with more, I'll likely find better choices. But that's also something that I'll need to keep in mind looking forward. Thank you for watching this, and I can't wait to look at all of yours. Comments are welcome, and I look forward to seeing you guys in class. These are my references.